Okay, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. So excited for the program I have in store for you, the audience. With my guest, I'm going to be covering Ireland and much of the criminally overlooked history of Ireland, post-colonialism, and who better to discuss Irish history after the semi-freedom that the British colonialists gave than Eugene McCartan, who is the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Ireland. So we'll be discussing Irish history from a post-colonialist, Marxist-Leninist perspective. So let's get straight into it. First off, Eugene, thank you for joining me today.
It's a pleasure, a pleasure.
It's a real honor to have you, and let's get into it. Now, Eugene, we're not going to talk too much about the Troubles and Northern Ireland, because I think there's been a lot. I think there's been a lot of, first off, there's been a lot of coverage of the Troubles in Northern Ireland and the ongoing UK colonialism, the sectarian there. I'm more interested in talking to. But of course, we will be, talking a little bit about, because we can't talk about the Republic of Ireland without talking about that. But I am very interested in talking about Ireland after, the Republic of Ireland after, independence was granted. But let's first talk a little bit about Ireland when it was, when the entire island was a colony of Britain. And the first question I wanted to ask you was, can you talk about how England? I was very shocked to read this because Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, an indigenous historian in the United States, when she was talking about settler colonialism in the U.S., she said that the model of settler colonialism that we saw in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the U.S., and some would even say Israel, South Africa, and Southern Rhodesia before it became Zimbabwe. She actually said that Ireland was actually the first model of settler colonialism, particularly in the north. And I was wondering if you can enlighten our audience, our audience about that.
Yeah, well, settler colonialism. Ireland was a template for many things because it was the first colony of Britain. So therefore, many of the practices that the British carried out across their empire were first applied in Ireland to see how they functioned, how they operated, and what lessons could be learned from it, and where they could be applied on a wider scale across the empire. So the settler colonial mindset is something which sometimes it's difficult to talk about here in Ireland because it's something that people don't want to talk about. Because there are a number of features to that. It's not just confined to the north of Ireland, where there traditionally was, whenever what was then would have been the English, began to expand and to colonize Ireland as a neighbouring country. Britain was a much more industrial, a much more advanced militarily, economically, and politically than Ireland next door. Ireland next door was a clan-based society. Therefore, the land was owned collectively and cooperatively by the people. The chieftains were democratically elected by the people. Then, whenever colonialism was imposed, they broke down those social structures and replaced them with property owning those who come in from with the English armies, Cromwell's armies, the Elizabethans. They were paid for their military service by land occupied or taken off the chieftains and the clans in Ireland. So, and then on top of that, then they brought in settler populations to consolidate their power. Become both take land and resources, but also administration. And so you had that sort of application of that. And then the same thing applied when the first settlers arrived in the United States. There was a common feature among a lot of them of all the settler colonialist mentality is that they all believed that the land was empty. There's nobody there before them. So therefore, or else at the times they have wrapped it up, have dressed it up in biblical terms, that they were on a God's mission to civilize far inferior beings who were happened to be there in the land that they wished to occupy. So that's where you got a common feature of the early settlers and various other things, the WASPs in the United States, that essentially there were no people of the equivalent, as they would say, the nations that were in, had lived in, and have farmed and lived in what was in America for thousands of years, were so inferior that they didn't count as people, and therefore they were quite happy to liquidate them, because basically, as far as they were concerned, they were no better than the vermin, the wolves, or the other animals around they found there in North America. So they were, as far as they were concerned, it was an empty land. So the same thing applies with the South Africans, with the Zionists in South Africa, the whites who went to Australia. It was about an empty land. There were people there. The people who were there weren't really people. They were inferior. They were slightly above animal, but not much more than that. So that whole approach of settler colonial mindset has been a very effective one, because it denigrated the people whom you were colonizing. It also feeds into imperialist ideology, because you had to, in order to justify the super exploitation and colonization globally, you had to win your population to the belief that they were on a civilizing mission, that they were actually bringing civilization to an inferior people, and therefore they were bringing the values of democracy and all these things that we believe in, as they would say, to these people who don't believe, have never experienced or don't believe these things. So racism and colonialism and colonial mentality is a product of imperialist ideology, and that is where to today it justifies the role of US imperialism, British imperialism, European Union imperialism, that they're bringing the economic system, the economic benefits of capitalism to those who really don't understand or don't appreciate it.
Thank you for that. Unbelievable. And wait, where is it? Now, Ireland, which has a large Catholic population and still very much a practicing Catholic population, they were very hostile to Britain. Now, for obvious reasons, but was there more of a cordial relationship when Britain was still explicitly a Catholic crown allied with the Vatican? And did things go more sour only when Henry VIII wanted to divorce his Spanish Catholic wife who couldn't bear him any kids? And then later, of course, the Church of England was formed, which is Anglican Protestant. And for Ireland, did much of the people still identify with the Vatican? They were very much attracted to some of the social justice messages of the Catholic Church that they saw as true Christians, and rejected, the new crown of Britain because with Protestantism there was that there's that ideology that Max Weber talked about, the Protestant ethic, which of course is very much the capitalist system. And so I was wondering if you could talk about that. Or these
are never like everywhere, are never uniform. People experience it different. There was up and for a number of centuries, actually, the British imposed what they called the anti-Catholic laws. That the laws were Catholics couldn't own 2 horses or 2 cows, or if they had 2 cows or 2 horses, they had to sell one or give one away. So in other words, it was a means to prevent the development of, how we say, the economic forces that within society, for allowing the Catholics themselves to accumulate capital. And that therefore ensured British domination over commerce right across the whole of the island. But a lot of people, was in the 1798, leading up to that, the biggest selling books in Ireland at that time was Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man. There was within that framework, there were forces gathering within that because people really knew that it was the established church. The established church was the Church of England, and all other little Protestant churches were oppressed by that the established church. And it's like many of the people who went from Britain, originally England, to the United States, they went as religious sects who had been persecuted by the established church. So you had the Plymouth Brethren and all these people who they went there because they were fleeing persecution by the English established church. And they brought with them that biblical approach to the whole question. And then also, like everything else, they applied the lessons of their own history, of the lessons of how they were oppressed to oppress others. So it's a way they've done it. But in Ireland, there was a movement of the people called the United Irish Movement in 1790s, which spilled on into the early 18th century, into who were united. It was Catholic, Protestant, and what they called dissenters. Dissenters were people who were Presbyterians. So they were basically people who had also been oppressed by the established church. But the British were clever enough in the early 1800s, in the Napoleonic Wars. The Presbyterians were in the main in the north of Ireland, were people who had were weavers, and so but they're individual weavers. They were scattered, hundreds of thousands that were scattered. What the British done then was to give them contracts to make uniforms for the British Army fighting Napoleon, and then out of that, then they concentrated into bigger units of production of weaving and the millings and stuff like that. That concentrated production, and then they have economically had found a stake in the British military system, the colonial empire. Then that merged, that whole developed in right across from the 18th into the 19th century, and that were basically whenever partition was coming about, Britain was able had a strong industrial base influence on a base in the north of Ireland, who were linked into the British Empire through the textile industry, the shipbuilding industry, engineering, all of which were in the north, all of which become the north was the most industrialized part of it, because that was where the British allowed the development of industry in the north in order to sustain its overall political and economic control over the whole of the country. So the north was the industrial base of Britain's colonial power in Ireland, and in what is now what basically what you call the southern, as it is now, was the provider of food and surplus labor. So that was the role. I mean, it's classic. It's no different. All countries today are allocated their place in the economic pecking order. Countries, you produce avocados, you produce cabbages, you produce this and you produce that. And now what you have then, you don't find on economies in Africa or Latin America, which are rounded economies. They're economies which are distorted to meet the metropolitan market. And that means then it makes them much more vulnerable to economic pressure, because you really, like in Africa, the destruction of the local agricultural systems has made them people dependent upon either single crops or aid. And that makes them, so that basically prevents then the people, if you are constantly dependent upon others, it makes you vulnerable to political and economic pressures. Never mind the whole impact of globalization, of the weather change and the environmental destruction. It makes you even more vulnerable, because your whole agricultural system is completely destroyed and distorted to meet the market. So countries in Africa are told to grow this particular fruit or that particular vegetable and ship them to the north, ship them to Europe. So these economic restructuring brought in by the IMF and the EU and the IMF and the World Bank were all part and parcel about creating levels of structured dependency. So countries then become structurally dependent upon the metropolitan north. That's United States, Canada, the European Union, and China and Japan. So that's why they've structured the economy. They've structured the global economy that way. So it makes people very vulnerable. And the same thing applies in the 26 counties here. The Irish government, originally the founding of the 26 county state was based upon what Britain, just like you were saying about when independence was granted. Independence, nowhere was independence ever granted.
Yeah.
Independence,
exactly. It was restructured.
independence was a product, the end product of a struggle of resistance to bring about that. No empire has ever granted anything to anybody other than what the people have fought for and won. And so what the forces that emerged in 1920-21, the War of Independence, the national movement, because one of the factors in it was at that stage, way back in that period, the 1920s, after 1916, that whole period, we call it the revolutionary decade, the ideas of anti-imperialism, of an understanding of the economic material basis of the exploitation was not very developed in Ireland. So therefore, you did not have a developed sense of anti-imperialism. You had a sense of a nationalism which was immersed in the whole question of Catholicism, because people knew that they were oppressed because of being Catholic, not because they went to the church, a different church. It was basically the bulk of the population were Catholic. Therefore, they were, because of their economic interests, material interests, were hostile to imperialism, to Britain. And in the North, the material interests of the people in the North, the majority, lied with remaining with the British Empire. So you had that too. So it broke down on those bases, but broke down on the basis of religion rather than the basis of their economic relationship. The people the bulk of the people in the South, which is now the Republic, were very much oppressed, very much marginalized, very much had no real influence or control. The population in the North, the unionist ruling class, a bourgeois class, owners of property, owners of capital, very much tied into the British Empire. Then they had created a whole political structure or superstructure whereby levels of dependency within the northern economy. So therefore they applied discrimination. So it meant that in order for unionism to maintain its power, it didn't rely upon a democratic man, it relied upon patronage. So therefore, if you were a member of the Orange Order, you got a job in the steelworks and the shipyards, the rope works, or all those things, and or in the police. And so therefore, but if you stepped outside of that framework, out of that network, then you became like the marginalized Catholic. You became a basis of where your material base become very, very, very precarious. So unionism was very clever, and as the British encouraged it, it creates this layer of dependency. So they created a structure whereby it was a vertical structure of within unionism. So it meant that Protestant people, unionist people, really, if they wanted to have a job or a house or get an education, or whatever else, they had to remain loyal to the framework constructed by unionism, a framework supported by imperialism. So that's when the civil rights movement broke, shattered that again. But in the South, in the 26 counties of the Republic of Ireland, that in the 1920s, there was the national movement, because it was not developed as an anti-imperialist force. It was an Irish nationalism. Nationalism itself is not bad or is not good. It's a nationalism, just basically so people identifying with themselves and others around them that share the common history, shared values, and they want to see those ideas and values reflected in the political and social administration of society. And so it can be progressive or it can be reactionary. It depends what the driving force is behind it. Irish nationalism was always progressive because it was always a force against occupation, a force against colonialism, a force for progress. So you have this process going on in after 1916, and then the War of Independence, 1919, 1920. There was a very strong. People were militarily militant, but then that wasn't necessarily having a lot of ideology behind it, other than the desire for independence, the desire to be sovereign. 1921, then 22, the movement then split. They opened up negotiations with the British. The British were clever. They saw the material interests of sections of the national movement, were able to draw sections, those national forces into its orbit, negotiated a treaty in 1922, and the partition of Ireland was one of the cornerstones. So that secured Britain's economic and political influence in the South, and secured its economic and political influence in the North. And then it divided divided the Irish people, or sent a fracture down through the Irish people around, in the north, around, presented it around Protestantism and Catholics, but in actual fact it was between two forms of democracy. One believed that the democratic expressions was through Britain, and the other believed that the only way they could find democracy, an end of repression, an end of discrimination, was in the form of an All-Ireland democracy. And that's still the clash today. Where does the democratic impulse lie? Does the democratic impulse lie to an All-Ireland democracy, or the democratic impulse lie with to be lying with Britain? Because lying with Britain then means that the minority becomes the majority on an enforced basis. So we have that. That's been the process, has gone on for some time, and it's like the split in the Irish national movement. It's like I know I listened to the podcast from the Black Agenda report, and they talk about black misleadership.
Yes.
Black misleadership. Yes. And I mean, you know you're really screwed when you see the same faces coming up and they're saying, "Oh, let's all talk here now." You know you're really screwed, and you see that in trade union meetings and stuff like that. You know, if an official comes in, you know, right, he's not going to block us. He's going to encourage and he's going to aid us to engage in struggle. And another one comes in and says, "No, you can't do that. You have to do it this way and you have to do it that way." So basically, one either aid you or one actually impede you. And I think that's where in 1922 we had those elements of the national movement impeded the struggle for national democracy, the struggle for national freedom, and they secured their material interests. Someone once described it as a train. The train of national independence was traveling along, and they decided, well, this is the stop, I'm getting off. They got off, and then basically then they stopped the train moving anywhere else. So they said, we're going no further. This is as far as we want to go. So they wanted to maintain their economic and political relationship with the British Empire. They wanted to be king of their little dunghill, but not necessarily to break the economic connections with imperialism, with the British. So therefore they set up the 26 county state. As James Connolly talked about, a carnival of reaction. So we ended up with a very reactionary Catholic Church. So because most of the views of the seen in the Catholic Church from the 19th century into the 20th century, right up until maybe 30, 40 years ago, were the values of the Catholic Church. If any studies done, you will see that they mirror and reflect the British Victorian values of the 19th century. Mm-hmm. So basically what the British did was the Catholic Church up until in the 1780s, up until the 1750s, 1760s, 1780s, right up until the early 1800s, Irish revolutionaries went to Europe. Therefore, they coalesced with what they saw the enemies, or the British saw the enemies of the British Empire. They coalesced with the French revolutionary forces. They coalesced with the Spanish. They coalesced with the Italians. Forces that the British saw as big challenges to their empire structure. So they saw that these priests were going to Europe. Political revolutions were going to Europe. They're being infested by radical ideas of the French Revolution, or rather infested by anti-British ideas. So what the British did was in the 1890s, they set up a Maynooth College, which was the main Catholic college in Ireland, the whole of Ireland, for training priests, nuns, and bishops and stuff like that. So the British set it up. So it took them a century. It took them a century for basically, before that, the structure of the Catholic Church was very fractured. In other words, it was locally based. And so after that, you find that, for instance, one of the biggest impulses that's consolidated the power of this British Church in Ireland was the famine. The famine decimated the population. It made the people very vulnerable, very, very vulnerable. And so if anybody comes to Ireland, if they go around the towns and villages, the city at the head of each village or town, there will be a big church, a Catholic church at one end, and possibly a big Protestant church at the other end. Most of those churches were built from 1850 onwards. Now there was the famine had demolished, broken up the social fabric of society. It broken up the communities. It broken up the local churches, and basically then you saw the beginning emergence of the institutionalized Catholic Church began to emerge. And that's where then the Victorian values began, from there church began to impose it. And that is where the Catholic Church, whenever it had power and control, it then began to basically, it didn't do its carry out its services through the Irish language. It used Latin or English. So therefore the Catholic Church became the vehicle for the Anglicization of Ireland. And it began then basically further pushing the Irish language and the Irish culture further and further and further out. And that is where, to a degree, if you lose your culture, language, then that's a big impact.
Actually, Eugene, can you repeat that again? Because there was a little bit of a delay in the
That the Catholic Church was one of the main vehicles for the propagation of Anglicization or English across the whole country, and because they were using Latin or English, whereas the Bible was never translated into the Gaelic language. They never spoke Gaelic in their services and stuff like that. So people then had to, if they wanted to go to mass and religious services, they had to listen to those services through English. So that began to weaken the whole Gaelic base of society. And I think that's to a degree that led into then in the 1880s, 1890s, that led into what they call then the Gaelic revival that became the culture. Culture became a critical element in the development of the national independence movement. It became a very critical element of that. And I think that the question of how that then the cultural revival in the 1880s, 1890s, that led then to the political connection, the development of the national independence movement around that, and then that developed. And James Connolly then came in on that discussion, where he talked about you cannot have independence without economic and political sovereignty, and without so therefore he put forward the question of the whole question of bringing in the argument, socioeconomic arguments into this, that the oppression of the working class, of the smaller farmers, of the rural poor, was a product of English colonialism, and therefore to undo poverty, to undo the mass exploitation, we need to fundamentally change the social and material base of society. And that's to the degree with the fault line that up in the 1920s, there was a movement within, there was a very undeveloped, but there was clearly a movement within the national independence movement. From after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, there was hundreds of Soviets set up all over the country. Workers who occupied factories. They took over the city of Limerick. They took over parts of Waterford to set up Soviets. So therefore, the ruling elements knew that there was a potentially for a mass social movement of the oppressed in Ireland. The British recognised that. The Unionists recognised that. The British realised that the Irish ruling class and unionism were far too weak to hold the line. And therefore, they believed by bringing in partition, accentuating the divisions in the north, and then basically creating this nucleus of a reactionary ruling elite in the south, backed up by the Catholic Church, that they'd be a better position to hold the line. And that's where we ended up when the Southern State was set up, the Republic of Ireland was set up. One of the first things they did was to institutionalize the role of the Catholic Church in the political and economic system. And then it basically became, the priests became, how would you say, the stormtroopers of the state. Anybody who spoke out, anybody who was agitating, all those, they were marginalized within communities, within the cities and within the rural communities, because the church controlled the schools, the church controlled the education, the church controlled the health service, whatever little health service there were. So they were all in a nexus, and then they would identify local agitators, condemn them from the pulpit, and marginalize them and drive them out, because there was no subsistence, no means of existing. If you hadn't got a job, it was very, very difficult. So therefore, it was enforcing immigration. So a lot of radicals left Ireland in the 1920s and the 1930s because there was no real basis. They couldn't find work. So the Catholic Church played a very, very key role in consolidating this reactionary state that was the 26 county state. And they played that by marginalizing the left, marginalizing Republicans, communists, marginalizing the more radical elements, and consolidated this state. And Fianna Fáil, and Labour carried on that practice because
and for people who don't know Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, those are the two rival oligarchic parties.
They were the two. They come out of the whole national independence movement. Fine Gael in particular were the backbone of the counter-revolutionary forces in the 1920s. They were backed by the British in the Civil War, what they call the Civil War, which we would call the War to Defend the Republic. During the Civil War, that party was armed by the British, or as precursor to that was armed by the British. And the guns and heavy artillery used by what they call the Free State government at that time were actually came from the British, and were the guns were used to suppress the Republican resistance were actually given to them by the British. So that whole sectarian state, what James Connolly called the carnival of reaction, it hasn't had an impact upon the people. It's had a huge impact upon how things develop. And then that was the case up until in the 1960s. Like everything else, reaction and reactionary ideas at a given historical moment in time, the ruling class will use them. But now the ruling class now believe that liberalism are the values that they must have, that everybody must have. You must have this value or that value. Otherwise, you're a reactionary and you're really against progress. So it depends what they want. Reaction at this point in time, liberalism at this point in time, and I'm sure they'll revert to reaction in another time. But that's how they do it. So everybody's been, so you either have to go with this particular tide or go against that tide. And much of the left get caught up on this, excuse my French, but this crap. And we end up not really understanding.
You mean the sort of superficial identity politics, the politics of representation, as opposed to the politics of Black revolutionary queer liberation.
Where does power? Where does power derive from? It's not derived from whatever idiot happens to be in the White House or in Dáil Éireann. It doesn't come from there. It comes from the people who have got real economic power. The corporations, individuals, banks, finance houses. They bankroll the system. What they have is, was a very famous communist Republican called Padre O'Donnell, and he was speaking on a platform against Ronald Reagan when Ronald Reagan was coming to Ireland, and he's speaking on a platform, and I think it's a very, how would you say, apt description. Someone asked him a question: "What do you think of the current politicians?" And he said, "They're monkeys in the superstructure."
Monkeys in the superstructure.
I think it's very, very apt. Very, very apt. Despite all their pretensions that they have power, they have no power. They have power, of course they do. I'd be wrong to say they don't have power. They do have power. But the real economic power base of this society is capitalism, is the material base of monopoly corporations and private, those who own capital, whatever else. This state, for instance, at this moment in time, there are 8 big planning applications coming in, being launched here to build apartments. The best part of 8,000 apartments. That's a lot of apartments. But they're corporations which are based in places like the Cayman Islands or Monaco and places like this, where you do not know who owns them, where they're from, where the capital comes from. So most of a large percentage of the housing market in the 26 counties is now dominated by transnational landlords.
And Google is the most notorious example.
Vulture funds, investment funds, now control large sections of the rental accommodation. So that means that vast sections of the population are now living in housing, which one time may have been controlled by absentee landlords, British absentee landlords, is now controlled by absentee corporate landlords. And so therefore, this whole society has become totally dependent upon foreign capital being invested to build private apartments, private housing, not for people to buy or own or anything like that, but to rent. So in other words, they're creating a whole basis of permanent rental structures. Permanent rental structures. It also means that if you're a small little landlord and you get one, you're renting your house or one house, I mean, if there's a boycott or people don't want to pay them, they're not in a strong position because they have to pay the bank and the mortgage, stuff like that. They're not in a very strong position. But if you're a global corporation and you've got buckets and buckets of dirty money in the Cayman Islands or in Monaco or wherever else, you can withstand any amount of mobilization of calling for rent strikes and stuff like that. You say, it doesn't really matter. Well, if you don't pay it, somebody else will. And that's the economic power. That is power. That is power. And so the Irish government has structured his housing policy around this, how do you say, that the Irish housing, I don't like using the term market, but that the Irish housing situation will be resolved or solved by finance capital, not by the Irish government building public housing and giving them to the people at affordable rents. That would be against the market, as the European Union calls it. That's interference in the market. So there, the Irish government is fully behind the idea of transnational capital, the vulture funds coming in from Wall Street or wherever else, coming in and buying up not just one house, thousands of houses on the go, thousands of apartment, one blocks, and just basically then rent. So you have no choice in the matter. You either go there or you're homeless. So that means then you've created the conditions where whole scale or large scale precarious employment, where people are working on the gig economies or on the service economies.
Yeah.
So you've got large scale precarious work, large scale sort of precarious wages. Those wages are precarious. If you're going to come in, if you're going to come in for 3 hours today and 4 hours tomorrow and whatever else, so you've got precarious wages. On top of that, now you've got precarious shelter, because you're only as good as you only have shelter so long as you're able to pay your rent. So the two other means, the means to pay your rent or whatever else are precarious. That means your shelter becomes precarious.
Yeah.
Your ability to pay. So they've created this whole layers and levels of precariousness within the economy that it makes them work. It's difficult for workers. If you are going to go and strike, you don't have $1,000 or €1,000 in the bank that I say, right, I can cover my rent for a month if I go on strike.
Yeah.
I can cover my rent. When you don't have that, when you're living on week to week, month to month, and that you have no means to which you can actually fight that way, unless the unions basically cough up rent, strike money, which will pay your costs, will pay for you to fight, and those pay your rent. You get enough money off the union to pay your rent and to buy food. And most unions don't have those resources. So it makes it very difficult for workers. They believe it. Unions very difficult to organize workers. So they believe that they have won. They have won. They have created the conditions whereby workers are not able to resist. And then on top of that, they've created layers of legislation to prevent workers fighting. Because in order to go on strike, you have to give 6 years notice, and you have to do this and you have to do that. They've created all these things with the so-called democracy that you must do this and you must do that and must do that. And by the time you look around, you don't know where you're coming or going because there's so much law being dumped on top of you. You say, what's the bloody point of it? What's the effing point? There's no point to this carry on. I can't do nothing about it. So what it does then, it just feeds despondency. It feeds despair. It feeds the sense of hopelessness. And that is where does the left give inspiration, or does it bog down in all this other stuff but presents itself as being radical?
Now, unfortunately, you have another appointment to get to.
I'll give you 15 minutes.
Okay. All right. Then. Okay. Perfect. Well, this just goes to show I need to have you back in so that we can talk more extensively. But then, two very quick questions. Then I have to ask is where? The first question I have to ask is, where do you stand on the whole issue of the European Union? Are you in the Communist Party of Ireland more of an EU Left Reformist like the Jan Varoufakis, or would you like to see in Irish Lexit, but way more prepared compared to Britain, which unfortunately, when they did exit the European Union, it was in the hands of the far right and the reactionary right.
It's like all things, we all have to value these things, even in the United States with us. If you're getting into battle, you have to weigh up the balance of forces. Where do the balance of forces lie? At this moment in time, the balance of forces do not lie on the side of progress. Do not lie on the side of the working class. So we are in favor of the breakup of the European Union. We supported the idea of Brexit. That's up to the people of Britain to decide that. But like everything else, the forces that were driving Brexit in the UK, there were two blocks. The largest block, the most influential block, was the Brexiteers, were the hard right of the Tory party. And then there was the left exit, which was the communists and the trade union elements. Right, where they came together in the same, not so much came together organizationally, but a philosophical view of the world, is that both of them wanted to see the British people being able to make laws and rules pertaining to the needs of the British people. So that's democracy. So the same thing with Ireland, that we would believe that the European Union's rules, because it's a rule-based, it's treaty. In order for you to change the rules in the European Union, you're going to have to get all the other member states to agree to change in the rules. So therefore, that's a huge attack upon democracy, because if we believe, they tell us that we should believe we're living in a democracy, therefore the Irish people have a right, if they elect a government that says we're going to build public housing, that we're going to restrict housing rents, that we're going to restrict the ability of foreign capital, transnational capital, to come in and buy up large sections of the housing stock, we're going to say that's not allowed anymore. The European Union, under European Union rules, they say, no, you cannot do that. We will sanction you if you do that. We will sanction you. If you want to borrow money for state investment. There was a big struggle here a few years ago around water, ownership of water. And the government wanted to bring in water charges, in other words, to commodify, to turn it into a commodity. Because once you put a price on it, therefore it becomes a commodity, and then it becomes your ability to pay. And then once you created a market, because that's what you've done, then you've created a market of paying for this commodity. Once you've created that market, under European Union rules, you cannot have a state monopoly. So therefore, you have to privatize part or all of your water services. So in other words, the government was then using the idea of water charges as the Trojan horse to commodify, to create a market. Then when they create a market, then under EU rules, they would have to fracture it, or either sell it over to a private company, or fracture it, have part private, part owned public. So therefore, it becomes part owned by private and public. It means then basically the private corporations say, you're charging too little, we can't make enough profit in this, therefore you have to increase the price. So this was all the nonsense that thing. So some of the left actually fell for this, and they went on around about the whole question of, it's double taxation, blah, blah, blah. We said, this is nonsense. This is about turning it into a commodity. This is about privatization. This is about ownership. In other words, we look at politics as about the question about how do we empower labor? How do we give labor more power? How do we weaken the power of capital? So we saw that this is how we actually, by calling for it, public ownership, not state ownership, public ownership, because there's lots of state companies here, but the government has sold quite a few of them off because they're owned by the state, not owned by the people. Because we want to also distinguish that it's their state, not our state.
Yeah.
It's their state, not our state. Therefore, we say that the water should be owned by the people. And therefore, if we want to privatize it, you would have to engage with and get the permission of the people. Now, you have to have a referendum of the people to privatize it. Not because some majority in the law says, that's a state company, we just pass a law and say we're privatizing, that's it, done. That's why we want ownership enshrined in the Constitution, of people's ownership in the Constitution. So that would have strengthened the hand of labour and weakened the real power of capital. So the same thing with the European Union. We drive at this whole question about if the ruling classes of Europe came together after 1948, after the defeat of fascism and the emergence of the Soviet Union and the socialist countries to the east. Also in Western Europe, You had the growth of huge communist parties in Spain and Portugal, in France, in Italy, and all the countries like Holland and Denmark, all had significant communist parties represented in their national parliaments because of their role they played in anti-fascism. So there was a huge growth in that. So all these countries, ruling classes of Europe in 1948, in the 50s, they all decided we either hang together or we're going to hang separately. So we cannot control, we're not in a position to dominate, control the working class. So they were forced together, and the United States actually supported this idea. So there was a contradiction within that, because the United States then was supporting the emergence of a potential economic and political challenge to them at a later stage. But that's why the United States was always iffy about Europe, iffy. It supported because it was a bulwark against communism, but at the same time, it was building up a competitor. And that's why they were very in favor of the British joining the European Union, because they saw that Britain was a Trojan horse inside the European Union. So to a degree, Trump, while he was a mad effort, he was actually saying what they were thinking, that it was good to weaken the European Union because it was becoming a challenge, economic challenge to them, and also was asserting itself independently in terms of it was developing its own military structures around PESCO and these battle groups. So therefore, it could possibly become a potential. See, the left only thinks in tomorrow or maybe next year. Imperialism thinks of decades. It thinks in terms of decades, in decades, not the Mickey Mouse things of tomorrow, because these are all not important. It's actually where the course of history is going. They're more concerned of and aware of the course of history, what needs to be done, where we need to be in 2 decades, 3 decades time. So that is where so we see that all the ruling classes of Europe constructed this European Union. And so we would say that an old working class additive, our objective is to strengthen our friends and weaken our enemies. So if the ruling class see the construction of the European Union as a means to strengthen their position, therefore, as a working class organization, revolutionary organization, our objective must be then to fracture that, weaken it, disrupt it, break it down, to weaken the power of our enemy and to strengthen the power of our allies of the working class across Europe. So that's our approach. We take a revolutionary anti-imperialist approach to it. We see that this is the manifestation of monopoly capital in Europe. Therefore, we must break it. We must break it. We must attack it. And it's not a view shared by much of the left. They think a lot of the left in Europe think that we're all mad nationalists. We don't see ourselves as nationalists. We see ourselves as very anti-imperialists. We just basically these are structures created by monopoly capital. Therefore, we know they cannot be reformed, they cannot be transformed, that we need move beyond them. How do we get beyond them? We have to break them down. And we have to find allies within Europe, find issues within the European working class that we can find unity around and fight around. And there's questions of workers' rights, a question of the European Union is the central driving force behind privatization. And I go back to the housing question. The European Commission has now been one of the major driving forces around the question. In Europe, there used to be a lot of rent controls and social housing. The European Union is the driving force to break that down, because they say it's an impediment to the market. You can't have rent controls and social housing and good social conditions for tenants in public housing and then have it shit conditions and extortionate rents in private housing. So basically, instead of attacking, they don't attack private landlords and corporate landlords. They say, right, we better dismantle the public provision of housing. Social housing, we have to fragment and break that down, because that's interfering with the market. So that is where we have to look at these things. The left, how do you say, absorbs so much of bourgeois ideology, so much of these bourgeois views and values, that they've lost a sense of what are they about. So we take a very, I wouldn't say simple, but are based upon our own history. We try to sort out what is real, what are the real issues, what are the essence of the struggle from all this chaff. And I think much of the left is just buried in the chaff.
Yeah.
And we have to get back, strip it all bare. Our objective, our sole objective of the communist movement of any left movement should be, is bringing the working class to state power. Nothing else.
Yeah.
Is bring our class to state power. And that means bringing them into confrontation with the economic and material base of this system. And what the left is really is the left has to understand capitalism better than capitalists, like Karl Marx did. But also the left has to understand itself better, because the ruling class understands the left. They understand it. They understand the worker class movement.
Yeah.
They know how to maneuver it, how to manipulate it, how to divide it. And the left has not really, to any significant, really fully understood or understands the nature of capitalism. And so they end up fighting all these other issues. We look at it and say, well, how is capital, how does it function, how does it operate? So during the last 2007, 2010, that big crisis, the left were going around screaming saying that austerity isn't working. Austerity isn't working. And that was the slogan within the trade unions, and the left were shouting. And we raised an alternative slogan. We said, austerity is working. It is working. It's working for those who it's designed to. It's about the transfer of wealth from the bottom up. From the bottom up. Therefore, we don't, like here, when we say that Ireland does not have a housing crisis. Ireland's got a crisis of the system, because the system has said that we are going to prioritize monopoly capital, finance capital, and how that money, how that capital is going to be invested in the Irish economy. It will be invested in the provision of private rented accommodation. And that's the government. The government said that. And that is what's working out in the economic decision making, the economic rules laid out by the government. And that's what's happening. That's what's happening. The government, the private investors are now building the apartments, owning them for rent. So therefore, we don't have a crisis in public housing. We have a crisis in capitalism. How capitalism says housing should be solved. How housing should be solved. And that's true that we have to go back to this, understanding that these governments, this state, any state, does not reflect the interests of the working class. So the left gets bogged down in this and that. Say in the Dáil, as Padre Annan said, monkeys in the superstructure. They go into the Dáil and hands up, hands down, hands up, hands down, walking into this committee and that committee. I'm not dismissing them. But once you believe that's the only vehicle or the main vehicle for change, then you've lost your way.
Yeah.
It's about how do we empower the class? How do we mobilize the class? How do we raise the political consciousness? As Marx talked about in the Communist Manifesto, radical change, radical transformation is only brought about by the actions of a radicalized people. So how do we radicalize the working class to bring about radical social and economic and political change? So sometimes we forget to put the cart before the horse. So who are we represent? We are not participants in this democracy. We are partisan in this discussion. We are partisan. These battles that are on, we are partisan. We don't sit and say, oh, this in the one hand, if in the other hand, and this is not the other. We are partisan. This is where we stand. This is where we fight. This is what we believe in. We don't sit on the fence and say, oh, exactly. This, the other, and we weigh this up and we have to do this and we have to do that. No, we are partisan. We take sides. And that's what we must do. We must take sides.
And I think that's a perfect place. Unfortunately, we have to end. But Eugene, let's stay in touch because I didn't even get to a quarter of the questions I want to get to. But let's stay in touch and let's let's try our best to do a follow-up interview.
No problem at all.
I don't want to keep you any more from another important appointment you get to.
No problem at all. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. So
Thank
we're
you.
joined on this edition of 1+1 with Eugene McCartan, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Ireland. But this conversation is to be continued, and I'm looking forward to having back.
Pleasure.
Talk
pleasure.
about
Irish.
Cheers till then.